Apparently, this conversation come into the mix once again, thanks to a couple of people in my social media and my subscription feed talking about it, so I'm gonna put my 2 cents on it once again, because you know what? I think this is one of the few times where my stance got somewhat more lenient, and since we're talking about game difficulties, I think this is about as good a time as any to replay Sekiro with some mods made by the men of culture. Before we get to the story, YouTube will probably demonetize this video, so if you'd like to support my work, you can do so by checking the links down below. Also, huge thanks to Joe and Jordan for the pledges on Patreon. You guys are fantastic. As I've discussed many times in the past, game journalists have gotten a rather bad rep amongst gamers for mainly being terrible at playing video games, and yet they're the ones who are supposed to be reviewing video games and telling us all about it. I've dissed on them many times in the past, and dissing them again just makes me feel like a broken record, but I can't help it sometimes. They say the dumbest stuff. Anyway, the discussion of game difficulty has happened for years, and it's been more of a thing ever since Cuphead reared its head. Thanks to the relentless difficulty, the game is criticized by so many outlets because it's just way too hard for them to finish. They demand an easy difficulty, and by that I mean one that doesn't punish the players for playing on easy. Then there's the whole Sekiro debacle, where game journalists are criticizing Sekiro for not providing an easier difficulty. I talk about those too. Gamers, including myself, argue that these games are meant to be played with a hard difficulty in mind. These games wouldn't be entertaining or fun otherwise, and the developers intended for these games to be that way. Ever since then, there are tons of discussions in social media between gamers, game journalists, and game developers even about how games should be designed or played. There are people who demand easier difficulty so that more people with different skill sets can play them, but then there are those who demand that games should be just the way they are and not be hampered with difficulty options that might ruin the core experience. Now you might notice that I didn't link my previous videos on this topic because I want to override my previous takes with this one. It depends. It depends on the game, it depends on the developer's intentions, it depends on what the game is trying to accomplish. It all depends. Seriously, people in social media are talking about this topic and generalizing their points too much. Let me try to bring up a couple of points that people usually bring up on this discussion and my rebuttal to those points, or more accurately, a clarification to those points.
Games are meant to be a challenge. Players are meant to overcome those challenges. The fun from the game comes from the success of overcoming those challenges.
Okay, but which game? Should a visual novel have challenge? If so, what kind of challenge? Should a narrative-driven game in general have challenge? If so, what kind of challenge? Should a game that has tons and tons of story content have challenge that would stop the players from enjoying the story? If so, what kind of challenge? And is it enough challenge to hamper those who merely just want to enjoy the game for the story? Or what about games that are meant to be relaxing? What kind of challenge do they need? There are so many different types of video games these days. We have video games that require the players to be fast or skillful or clever, and we have video games with story content where the players don't really have to be that way. And sometimes we have video games that offer both gameplay and story. So when you say that games are meant to be a challenge, I need to ask, which game? I suppose games in general are meant to be a challenge, but games these days are not just limited to your action games or tactical games. We also have visual novels or narrative-driven games. That is, unless you're one of those elitists who don't consider them video games, and that's another conversation entirely. And when I ask about what kind of challenge, I mean, how challenging does the game need to be? If the game has a lot of story content and there are people who want to enjoy them, should the game be really hard and bothersome? Or should it be just a walk in the park? Why not appeal to both sides? Do you feel that this discussion is way too general? Because it is way too general, which is why my reply is, it depends. But this brings me to another point.
If your games only have story content and can be enjoyed just by the story alone, then why can't it be just a movie?
That also really depends on the game. If the game is just a completely straight and linear single-player affair, then yes, it might as well as be a film. But what about games with narrative choices? What about games that let you as a player to choose how the story would go? What about games that have tons of story content and side quests? What about games that are meant to immerse you in an entirely different world? What about visual novels? They have multiple routes and multiple endings. They have different interactions that you can do as a player. How how are you going to adapt that particular aspect in a non-interactive medium? By doing every route and only truly commit to one? Or maybe adapting those routes into different stories? You can't simply generalize that games that can be enjoyed by its story content alone should just be a film or an anime. There are many different types of games out there with varying degrees of content density. Can video games just be films if there are only story content? It depends on the game. And here's another question to ask. How many good video game adaptations are there? It's not an easy task to take some random video game and just turn it to films.
If you're playing a game for the story, just watch a walkthrough.
Again, it depends. Are you talking about a game that has nothing but narrative content? Are you talking about games that can be finished in around 6 to 8 hours? If so, you probably won't miss a lot by just simply watching the walkthrough. But what about games like JRPGs where it can take like 100 hours plus to beat the game? Are you willing to watch 100 hours plus of someone else playing the game? The cutscenes of Xenoblade Chronicles 2 alone has to be split into 10 parts around 1 hour each, and that's only covering the main storyline. The game has side quests and many other interactions that the cutscenes versions will cut for the sake of showing just the main storyline. Once again, it depends. And you know what else it depends on? It depends on your interest towards the game. I am someone who watched all the cutscenes of Persona 5, not because I don't want to play the game, but because at the time I don't have a PS4. Right now I have a PS4. I have the game and I played it for 160 hours plus at this point. I can watch the cutscenes because I'm really invested in a franchise. I can't say the same to those who aren't invested by them. And I can tell you for sure that the cutscene version misses a lot of content, like text messages, small interactions happening inside the school, social links, etc. Now sure, I can experience all of this by just watching the walkthrough, but again, the walkthroughs will be around 60 to 100 hour plus. I don't have time to watch the walkthrough version because I just want to know the main storyline. But just knowing the main storyline isn't enough to truly enjoy this game. Heck, the person playing the game could make decisions or dialogue choices or romance options that I wouldn't make if I'm the one holding the controller. So what's the solution? How can you make someone to enjoy the game's story without being bothered by the gameplay too much? By having an easier difficulty. But like I said, not every game needs a difficulty slider. It depends on the games, it depends on the developer's intentions. Watching the cutscenes on YouTube or watching someone else play the game are not as entertaining as actually playing them. It's not just about the combat or the challenge, it's about the freedom that being a player gives. You can choose what kind of story that the game wants to tell you. You can control what your player character does and what kind of story that you want the player character to be involved in. A walkthrough is limited to what the YouTuber does, but even on this, it depends. For certain types of video games, a walkthrough is enough, and for others, it's not enough. That's precisely why we have difficulty options for those who just want to enjoy the story. Nothing wrong with that. But that's just one side of the discussion. Let's talk about the other side.
If the entire point of your video game rests on a player's ability to perform fast-click challenges and precision jumping and BS mechanic gimmicks, then you aren't telling a good story. You are making Bop It for grown-ups.
Oh wow, bop it for grown-ups. Not exactly the worst insult that you can give to video games. But yeah, I saw this take on Twitter, and removing the bop it part, I actually agree. I mean, those super hard NES games aren't trying to tell you a good story. If they were, then Ghosts and Goblins would be a guy being surrounded by monsters who want to strip him naked for his bone. I mean, to his bones. This ain't a Monster Girl game. Again, it depends on what game you're talking about. I think games that require fast reflexes and knowledge on the game's mechanics, like the NES games, are generally not played for the story. They're played for the gameplay, and there's nothing wrong with that. If these bop it for grown-ups are fun to play, what's wrong with that? Let's talk about another point, mainly discussed by this article from Ars Technica.
Every game should copy Death Stranding's very easy mode.
Once again, it depends. And it depends not just on the game, but the developer's intentions as well. Sekiro, for example, is a game intended to be played in one way, on a specific difficulty that you can increase later on. If you remove the game's difficulty, what you'll have is a game with a not so great story and beautiful looking environments. But why would you purchase a $60 game just for sightseeing? That's dumb. This game is meant to be played with the hard difficulty in mind, because the game's primary content is the combat. Death Stranding, on the other hand, this is a game featuring big Hollywood actors like Norman Reedus and Mads Mikkelsen, so the story content is going to consume a huge huge chunk of the game. Not only that, but Kojima himself wants to have this difficulty to be put in the game. He wants everybody to play this game, including those who don't play video games that often. That's very noble of him. So should every game copy Death Stranding's very easy mode? It really depends on the developer's decision. So I'm gonna put this quote from Mads Mikkelsen on Doctor Strange.
Maybe. Who am I to judge?
There's nothing wrong with game developers trying to be more inclusive to as many players as possible. There's also nothing wrong with developers to be exclusive and only makes games for a specific type of crowd. Not everyone will enjoy Sekiro's relentless difficulty, and if you're one of those people who ask for the game to be easier, you're probably not interested in the game to begin with, and you're not the target demographic for the game. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But journalists beg for easier difficulty so that it makes their job easier, while hiding behind the shield of disabled people by talking about accessibility.
Not every player wants to suffer through gatekeeping challenges just to see a game.
And this is a segment that got a lot of people to instinctively reply, just like when I say that The Godfather is directed by the old man from Up. The writer brings up gatekeeping because it's really bad to gatekeep video games from certain types of people. But even on this particular topic, I'd say it depends. I don't know if I've made this take before, but I'm going to say it. Gatekeeping is not always wrong, and you can't always be inclusive. Not everyone can enjoy everything. I, for one, don't enjoy horror games, but people don't have to make horror games less scary or remove all the ghosts and monsters just to appeal to me. That's ridiculous. There are, however, people who would advocate for those change. Just replace horror with anything popular these days, like shonen animes. Let's make shonen animes to be less appealing to young boys and more appealing to fujoshis or something. Now for those people who I'm going to call fakers, I'm totally fine with gatekeeping them. They should be put far away from the hobbies. They want to turn our hobbies into something that they're not. It is, however, wrong to gatekeep your hobby based on your identity traits, like your gender, race, etc. You can't just say that you're white or black and therefore you're not allowed to enjoy video games. I'm betting $1 million that the fakers would use their identity as a shield. Oh, these people harass me or kick me out because I am insert gender or race here. It's not because I want a certain genre to appeal to someone like me who doesn't like the genre in the first place and only say that I like it because it's trending. I want to continue the article for a bit and highlight this paragraph.
What more and more developers are now realizing is that there's no reason their games can't appeal to both groups. With a super easy mode in the mix, the players themselves can choose if they want a toughest nails test of skills and strategy or a more relaxing exploration of a detailed interactive world.
Again, it depends on the game. There are and will be reasons for video games to be played with a difficult gameplay in mind, but there are also games that cater to both sides. It depends on which type of game and the developer's intentions for the game. I say depend way too much on this video, and I don't think I'm gonna make a drinking game out of that. Some developers want to be inclusive, others want to be exclusive or appeal to a more niche audience. Nothing wrong with either, but journalists seems to think that being inclusive is the only way you should do it. The article tries to put a comparison with a book being locked and a caption saying, "Before you can read this book, please fill out the following reading comprehension quiz." The funny thing is, gatekeeping in books have existed for a while now, and also in that very form that you illustrated. Not literally, obviously. This quantum physics book requires some comprehension on basic physics. This high school math book requires some comprehension on kindergarten math. These books are gatekeeping those who don't have comprehension on basic physics and math. There's nothing wrong with that, unless if the book was supposed to be one of those for dummies book. I've even seen people who would refuse to read a book if there aren't any audiobooks on them, because some people just don't like to read for one reason after another.
More than that, Hutchinson's attempted analogy to books is a little telling. We'd never tolerate a book that required readers to complete a short quiz before each chapter to ensure they had fully absorbed what came before.
Writer, have you ever been to a school? Because you're describing every school book ever. And yes, books in general don't usually quiz you for your comprehension on the first chapter, but they will, however, assume that you have comprehended the first chapter when you enter the second chapter. You're not seriously advocating to straight up skip levels entirely.
Plenty of game makers seem perfectly content completely stopping players from even trying level 5 through 25 until they have finished level 4.
Yes, you're supposed to finish level 4 first before you can go to level 5, just like how you're supposed to finish chapter 1 before you go to chapter 2 in a book. I can't even say that it depends right now because there are only very few games out there in the market that lets you to skip levels. I think it's because level passwords aren't a thing anymore, or cheats in general. I do remember those Android quiz games letting you to skip levels, and even then, only if you correctly guess at least 5 or 10 things in one level out of 20 or 30 questions. So in conclusion, video games have grown into many different forms that it's really difficult to put a general judgment on them or what they're supposed to do as video games. Doom can be either a challenging game or a relaxing game. Sekiro can only be a challenging game. That's the main appeal of it. But it's really different from person to person, game to game, and developer to developer. Personally, I want my JRPGs to not stress me out too much on the gameplay front and just let me enjoy the story. On the other hand, I want my Sekiro to beat the living crap out of me. I want my ultra hard NES games to beat the living crap out of me. There are people who prefer these games to be easy, but the problem is these games are meant to be difficult. You wouldn't be able to enjoy these games otherwise, and you'll probably end up giving it a bad review saying, oh, it's just really easy and tedious button mashing. In fact, there are many games out there whose experience would be much worse if the game is made easier. But once again, it depends. But regardless of your opinions, I think we can all agree on one thing. We really need to get these fakers out of our hobbies.